When a young boy claims to have an identical twin he's never met, his mother's search for answers uncovers a decade-old secret that shatters their world, and brings two families together in ways they never imagined. 10-year-old Alden Porter walked home from school with a furrowed brow, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite make sense of. It had been an ordinary day at Cedar Grove Elementary until recess, when something happened that left him feeling unsettled. As he entered the small, cozy house he shared with his mom, Eleanor, he dropped his backpack by the door and called out, "Mom, I'm home." Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Hey, sweetheart," she greeted him with a warm smile. "How was school?" Alden hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "It was weird." Eleanor's smile faded as she crouched down to his level. "Weird how? Did something happen?" He nodded, his green eyes wide with confusion. "I think I saw my identical twin." For a moment, Eleanor didn't respond, assuming she'd misheard him. "You're what?" "My twin," Alden repeated. "At recess. There was this boy, and he looked exactly like me, Mom. Same face, same hair, same everything. It was like looking in a mirror." Eleanor stared at him, unsure how to react. Alden had always been an imaginative child, but this claim was unlike anything he'd said before. "Maybe he just looks a little like you," she suggested gently. "Sometimes people can resemble each other even if they're not related." "No, Mom," Alden insisted, his voice firm. "It wasn't just a resemblance. It was me. I'm sure of it." Eleanor frowned, trying to process his words. She placed a hand on his shoulder, searching his face for any sign he might be exaggerating or joking. But Alden looked serious, deeply serious. "Okay," she said finally. "What's this boy's name?" "I don't know," Alden admitted, his voice dropping. "I didn't talk to him. I couldn't. It was too weird." Eleanor stood, her thoughts swirling. She had no memory of giving birth to twins. Alden was an only child, as far as she knew, but his insistence planted a seed of doubt in her mind. What if? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. It wasn't possible. She would know if she had twins, wouldn't she? Still, something about Alden's claim unsettled her. He wasn't prone to making things up, and the look in his eyes told her he truly believed what he'd seen. Deciding not to dismiss it outright, she gave him a reassuring smile. "Let's not worry about it right now, okay? Maybe tomorrow you can find out his name and talk to him." Alden nodded reluctantly, though the unease on his face didn't fade. "Okay," he said, heading to his room to start his homework. That night, after Alden had gone to bed, Eleanor sat in the living room, staring at an old photo album. She flipped through pictures of Alden as a baby, her fingers brushing against the glossy pages. His birth had been a difficult one, complicated and chaotic. She remembered being sedated after the delivery due to complications, waking hours later to find Alden cradled in the arms of a nurse. What if something had happened during those hours she couldn't remember? What if? She shook her head again. It was impossible. But as she closed the album and glanced toward Alden's room, a knot of doubt tightened in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than she knew. The next morning, Alden was unusually quiet at breakfast, pushing his cereal around in the bowl instead of eating. Eleanor watched him carefully, sensing that his mind was still on the boy he'd seen at recess the day before. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked gently, sitting down across from him. Alden shrugged, keeping his eyes on the table. I can't stop thinking about him." Eleanor's heart ached for her son. She knew he wasn't the type to get worked up over nothing, and his reaction only made her more uneasy. "Why don't you talk to him today?" she suggested. "Find out his name, maybe ask him if he has a brother. It could clear things up." Alden hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. I'll try." At school, Alden spent the morning glancing around the classroom and the hallways, hoping to catch another glimpse of the boy. By the time recess came, his stomach was in knots. He stepped outside with his classmates, scanning the playground, and his heart leaped when he spotted the familiar figure by the swings. The boy was sitting alone, idly kicking his feet in the sand. Alden took a deep breath and approached him, his palms sweaty. When he got closer, the boy looked up, and Alden felt his breath catch. It was like staring into a mirror. "Hi," Alden said awkwardly, his voice wavering. The boy tilted his head, studying Alden with wide, curious eyes. "Hi. What's your name?" Alden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Caleb," the boy replied. "What's yours?" "Alden." For a moment, neither of them said anything, both too stunned to continue. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "You look just like me." "You look like me," Alden corrected automatically. He paused, then asked, "Do you have a brother?" Caleb shook his head. "No. It's just me and my mom." Alden's stomach churned. "Are you sure? What if you have a brother you don't know about?" Caleb frowned, his confusion mirroring Alden's. "I don't think so. But, maybe. I mean, this is kinda weird." The two boys stared at each other, their minds racing. Alden's teacher called the class back inside before they could say more, but as they parted ways, Caleb called out, "Wait. What if we are brothers?" Alden turned, his heart pounding. "I don't know," he said. "But I think we need to find out." When Alden got home that afternoon, he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. He burst through the door, calling for his mom. Eleanor, who had been folding laundry, rushed to meet him in the living room. "Mom," Alden said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "His name is Caleb, and he doesn't know if he has a brother, but he looks exactly like me." "Exactly. What if he's my twin?" Eleanor felt her legs weaken, and she sat down on the couch, staring at her son. "Caleb," she repeated. "And he doesn't know if he has a brother?" Alden nodded frantically. "He said it's just him and his mom." Eleanor's mind raced. She couldn't ignore this anymore, Alden's certainty, the boy's name, the fact that he was being raised by a single mother. It all felt too coincidental. But how could it be true? She had never been told she had twins. "Where does Caleb live?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't know," Alden admitted. "But we could ask him tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, already feeling her resolve harden. "Okay. Tomorrow, you find out more. And in the meantime, I'll see what I can figure out." That night, Eleanor barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of Alden's birth. The complications, the long hours she had been unconscious, it all felt hazy, as though there were pieces missing. Could there have been another baby? Could someone have made a mistake? Or worse, could someone have intentionally kept it from her? The next day, Alden returned from school with more information. "Caleb's mom's name is Sandra Delaney," he told Eleanor. "And he said they live on Willow Street." Eleanor's breath hitched. Willow Street was just a few blocks away. She grabbed her phone and searched for Sandra's name in the local directory. Sure enough, there it was, a listing for Sandra Delaney, just as Alden had said. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor dialed the number. The phone rang several times before a woman's voice answered. "Hello?" the voice said, cautious but polite. "Hi," Eleanor began, her voice trembling. "My name is Eleanor Porter. I think we need to talk." The following afternoon, Eleanor and Alden arrived at the park, where Sandra Delaney had agreed to meet them. The spring air was crisp, and children's laughter echoed through the space as they swung on monkey bars and raced across the open fields. Eleanor's heart pounded as she scanned the crowd, searching for Sandra and Caleb. There they are, Alden said, tugging on her sleeve. He pointed toward a wooden bench near the playground, where a woman and a boy sat. Eleanor's breath caught when she saw them. Caleb looked so much like Alden that for a moment, it felt as though she were seeing double. Sandra stood as they approached, her expression cautious but kind. She was a tall woman with dark curls and a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor?" she asked. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice wavering. "And this is Alden." Sandra's gaze shifted to Alden, her eyes widening as she took in his face. She glanced at Caleb, who was standing beside her, and then back at Alden. "Wow," she murmured. They really do look alike." The boys stared at each other, their identical green eyes wide with curiosity. Caleb broke the silence first. "Hi," he said, giving a small wave. "Hi," Alden replied. Eleanor and Sandra exchanged an awkward glance before sitting on the bench. The boys wandered toward the playground, but their attention remained fixed on each other, as if they were trying to make sense of what they were seeing. "So," Eleanor began, folding her hands in her lap, "thank you for meeting with us. I know this might seem strange, but Alden came home the other day insisting he saw his twin. When he described Caleb and said his name, well, I had to reach out." Sandra nodded slowly. "I understand. And honestly, when Caleb told me about Alden, I didn't know what to think. But seeing them together now," she trailed off, her eyes following the boys as they climbed onto a set of swings. "It's uncanny." Eleanor hesitated before asking the question that had been burning in her mind. "Sandra, did you adopt Caleb?" Sandra's expression softened, and she nodded. "Yes. I adopted him as a baby. He was born at Ridgewood General Hospital." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her. "That's where I had Alden," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 10 years ago." Sandra's brow furrowed, and she turned to face Eleanor fully. You gave birth there?" "Yes," Eleanor replied. "But there was a lot of confusion during my delivery. I had complications, and I was unconscious for hours. When I woke up, they handed me Alden, and I never questioned anything. But now..." Sandra's eyes widened, and she covered her mouth with her hand. Do you think they might be twins?" "I don't know," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "But it feels like too much of a coincidence. Their resemblance, their ages, the hospital, it all lines up." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the possibility sinking in. Finally, Sandra spoke. "I think we need to find out the truth." Eleanor nodded. "I agree. But how?" Sandra hesitated, then said, "We could start with a DNA test. If they are twins, it would show in their results." Eleanor exhaled deeply, relief mingling with apprehension. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." They called the boys back over, explaining the situation in terms they could understand. "We're going to do a special test," Eleanor said gently. "It will tell us if you two are related." Caleb looked at Alden, his face a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Do you think we are?" "I think so," Alden replied with quiet certainty. Sandra and Eleanor exchanged a glance, each seeing the same mixture of hope and fear reflected in the other's eyes. They arranged to meet at a nearby clinic the following day to have the DNA samples collected. As Eleanor and Alden walked home, Alden finally spoke. "Mom, what if Caleb really is my brother?" Eleanor smiled, though her heart felt heavy with the weight of the unknown. "Then it means you found something very special, Alden. No matter what, we'll figure this out together." The clinic was quiet when Eleanor, Alden, Sandra, and Caleb arrived the following day. The air was thick with anticipation as they stepped inside, the receptionist greeting them with a warm smile. Despite the calm environment, Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she filled out the paperwork. The implications of what they were about to uncover were almost too overwhelming to process. Alden sat beside Caleb in the waiting area, the two boys exchanging glances and small smiles. They had already started to form a bond, even without knowing for certain if they were brothers. Caleb leaned over and whispered something to Alden, causing both of them to laugh softly. Watching them, Eleanor felt her chest tighten. The resemblance wasn't just physical, their mannerisms and energy were eerily similar. Sandra sat beside Eleanor, her expression a mixture of curiosity and worry. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said quietly. "Seeing them together like this." "It is," Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels right, but also so confusing. I keep asking myself how this could have happened." Sandra nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "If they are twins, I can't imagine how we didn't know. The adoption agency never said anything about Caleb having a sibling." Before Eleanor could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway, calling them back. "We're ready for you now." The boys hopped off their chairs and followed the nurse eagerly, their nervous energy palpable. Eleanor and Sandra trailed behind them, exchanging one last uncertain glance before stepping into the small examination room. The nurse explained the process to the boys, her tone light and friendly. "We're just going to take a quick swab from the inside of your cheek," she said, holding up the testing kit. "It won't hurt a bit." Alden went first, sitting still as the nurse gently swabbed his cheek. Caleb watched closely, his curiosity outweighing his nerves. When it was his turn, he sat in the chair confidently, mimicking Alden's stillness. "All done," the nurse said cheerfully, sealing the samples in labeled envelopes. "We'll send these to the lab, and you should have the results in a few days." As they left the clinic, the boys chattered excitedly about the test, their voices filled with anticipation. Eleanor and Sandra, however, walked in silence, the weight of the situation settling over them like a heavy cloud. That evening, back at home, Eleanor struggled to focus on anything other than the upcoming results. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring out the window as Alden played quietly in the living room. Memories of his birth replayed in her mind, how she had been so relieved to finally hold him after hours of uncertainty, how she had trusted the hospital staff completely. What if something had gone wrong during those hours she couldn't remember? What if someone had made a decision that changed their lives forever? "Mom." Alden's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway. "Yes, sweetheart," she asked, her voice softer than usual. "Do you think Caleb is really my brother?" he asked, his green eyes filled with hope and a hint of fear. Eleanor walked over and knelt in front of him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "I don't know, Alden," she admitted. "But I do know that no matter what the results say, you'll always have people who care about you." Alden nodded, though he still looked uncertain. "I just feel like he is. Like I've known him forever." Eleanor smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Sometimes our hearts know things before our heads do," she said. "Let's just take it one step at a time." Over the next few days, the waiting became almost unbearable. Every time the phone rang, Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat, only to realize it was a telemarketer or a friend calling. Sandra texted her frequently, sharing the same mix of impatience and anxiety. The boys, meanwhile, seemed blissfully unaware of the tension, spending hours on the phone or playing games whenever they could. Finally, the call came. Eleanor's hands shook as she answered, and when the receptionist at the clinic confirmed that the results were ready, she immediately called Sandra. They agreed to meet at the park to open the results together. When they arrived, Eleanor held the envelope tightly in her hands, her palms damp with sweat. The boys sat on a nearby bench, their laughter carrying across the park as they played a game of rock paper scissors. "Are you ready?" Sandra asked, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. Eleanor nodded, taking a deep breath. She carefully opened the envelope and pulled out the sheet of paper. Her eyes scanned the text, and her breath caught when she saw the bold conclusion at the bottom of the page: probability of sibling relationship, 99.9%. They're twins, Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. They're really twins. Sandra leaned over, reading the result for herself. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears filled her eyes. "Oh my God," she said. "They are." Eleanor looked up at her, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, joy, and heartbreak. "How did this happen?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How were they separated?" Sandra shook her head. "I don't know. But we need to find out." They called the boys over, their hearts pounding as they prepared to tell them the truth. When Alden and Caleb sat down, Eleanor took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she said, "We have something to tell you." The boys looked at each other, their identical green eyes wide with anticipation. "What is it?" Alden asked. Eleanor smiled through her tears. "You're brothers. You're twins." For a moment, the boys sat in stunned silence. Then Caleb grinned and said, "I knew it." Alden laughed, his relief and excitement clear. "Me too." As the boys hugged each other, their laughter ringing out, Eleanor and Sandra exchanged a look of determination. The truth had brought them this far, but there were still so many unanswered questions. They silently vowed to uncover the rest of the story, for their boys, and for themselves. The revelation that Alden and Caleb were twins was both a moment of clarity and the beginning of a deeper mystery. After sharing the news with the boys, Eleanor and Sandra decided they needed answers about how such a life-altering mistake had occurred. The adoption agency's involvement and the circumstances surrounding the boys' separation weighed heavily on their minds. A few days after receiving the DNA results, Eleanor and Sandra arranged a meeting with the director of Ridgewood Family Services, the agency responsible for Caleb's adoption. The office was housed in a modest brick building with a small waiting area filled with toys and pamphlets about fostering and adoption. The director, an older woman named Margaret Stanton, greeted them with a professional yet wary smile. "Eleanor Porter, Sandra Delaney, please come in," she said, gesturing to her office. Once inside, Eleanor wasted no time. "We're here because of a grave mistake your agency made," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "Our sons are twins, and somehow, they were separated at birth." Margaret's expression tightened, her hands folding neatly on the desk. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said carefully. "Caleb's adoption records indicate he was placed with his adoptive family after being surrendered as an only child." "He wasn't an only child," Sandra interjected. "We have DNA results proving he and Alden are twins. Eleanor gave birth to both of them at Ridgewood General Hospital." Margaret's face paled slightly, though she maintained her composure. "This is the first I'm hearing of this," she said. "But if what you're saying is true, it's deeply concerning. Let me pull up Caleb's file." She turned to her computer, typing quickly. Eleanor and Sandra sat in tense silence, their gazes fixed on Margaret's face as she read through the file. After a few moments, Margaret frowned and turned back to them. "There's a note in Caleb's file about his birth," she said slowly. "It says he was surrendered for adoption due to complications during delivery. The biological mother was listed as unable to care for him." "That's not true," Eleanor said, her voice rising. "I never surrendered him. I didn't even know he existed." Margaret's frown deepened. "This is highly unusual. It's possible there was a miscommunication or a clerical error. The hospital's records may hold more information." Eleanor's fists clenched. "This wasn't a miscommunication. Someone made a deliberate choice to separate my children." Sandra placed a calming hand on Eleanor's arm. "Let's get the hospital records," she said. "That's the next step." Margaret nodded. "I'll contact Ridgewood General on your behalf and request access to the records. This will take some time, but I assure you we'll get to the bottom of this." The meeting ended with Eleanor and Sandra feeling a mix of frustration and determination. As they left the agency, Eleanor turned to Sandra. "I'm not waiting around for their red tape," she said. "I'm going to the hospital myself." Sandra nodded in agreement. "I'll come with you." The next day, the two women arrived at Ridgewood General Hospital, the place where both Alden and Caleb had been born. The hospital's sterile hallways and bright fluorescent lights were a stark contrast to the emotions swirling inside them. They met with the records administrator, a middle-aged man named Paul. Eleanor explained the situation, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "I need to see my medical records from the day I gave birth here. My sons were separated, and I believe a mistake, or worse, was made." Paul raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the request. "That's an unusual situation," he said, flipping through his ledger. "Let me check what we have on file." After what felt like an eternity, Paul returned with a thick folder. He handed it to Eleanor. "Here's everything we have from that day." Eleanor opened the folder with trembling hands, Sandra peering over her shoulder. As they flipped through the documents, one note stood out: Twin A delivered at 3:14 a.m. Twin B delivered at 3:16 a.m. Twin B transferred to neonatal care unit for observation. Eleanor's breath hitched. "Twin B," she whispered. "That must be Caleb." The note continued: "Mother sedated post-delivery due to complications. Consent for adoption signed by hospital administrator on behalf of patient." Sandra's eyes widened. "They signed for you?" she asked incredulously. "Without your knowledge?" Eleanor's voice shook with anger. "I was unconscious. I never gave permission." Paul frowned as he examined the record. "This is irregular," he admitted. "It's highly unusual for a hospital administrator to sign on behalf of a patient, especially for something as serious as adoption." Eleanor's hands trembled as she held the folder. "Who signed it?" she demanded. Paul pointed to a name scrawled at the bottom of the document: Dr. Richard Malvern. Eleanor's face darkened with recognition. "He was my doctor," she said. "He handled my delivery." Sandra's expression hardened. "We need to speak with him." Paul hesitated. "Dr. Malvern retired several years ago," he said. "But I can give you his last known contact information." Eleanor and Sandra left the hospital with the records in hand and a renewed sense of purpose. They were closer to uncovering the truth, but the path ahead was uncertain. As they drove home, Eleanor glanced at Sandra, her resolve stronger than ever. "No matter what it takes," she said, her voice firm, "we're going to find out what happened. For Alden and Caleb." Sandra nodded, her expression just as determined. "We owe it to them. They deserve to know the truth." A few days later, Eleanor and Sandra sat in Eleanor's living room, poring over the hospital records they had retrieved. The name, Dr. Richard Malvern, stared back at them from the document, a stark reminder of the person who might hold the key to understanding why Alden and Caleb had been separated. "We have to speak to him," Eleanor said, her voice resolute. "He's the one who signed off on the adoption. He has to know why this happened." Sandra nodded. "I agree. But what if he refuses to talk?" Eleanor clenched her fists. "Then we'll find someone who will. I'm not giving up." With the contact information provided by the hospital, they tracked down Dr. Malvern to a retirement community on the outskirts of Ridgewood. The following morning, they made the drive, the tension in the car palpable. Alden and Caleb stayed home with a trusted neighbor, unaware of the confrontation their mothers were about to face. The retirement community was a quiet, picturesque place with manicured lawns and charming cottages. A receptionist directed them to Dr. Malvern's unit, and they knocked on the door, their hearts pounding. The door opened to reveal a frail, elderly man with thinning white hair and sharp, piercing eyes. He studied them for a moment before speaking. "Can I help you?" "Dr. Malvern," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "My name is Eleanor Porter, and this is Sandra Delaney. We need to talk to you about something that happened 10 years ago. Dr. Malvern's brow furrowed. I'm retired, he said curtly. If this is about a medical matter. It is, Eleanor interrupted, holding up the hospital records. You were my doctor when I gave birth at Ridgewood General. My sons, Alden and Caleb, were born on the same day. But Caleb was put up for adoption without my consent. Dr. Malvern's eyes flickered with recognition, and his expression darkened. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, moving to close the door. Eleanor blocked it with her hand. Please, she said, her voice breaking. We just want to know the truth. Why were they separated? Why didn't I know about Caleb? The tension in the air was thick as Dr. Malvern hesitated. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing them to enter. I'll give you 10 minutes, he said gruffly. Inside, the cottage was neat and sparsely decorated, with shelves lined with books and family photos. Dr. Malvern gestured for them to sit at a small dining table. Say what you need to say. Sandra spoke first. We found records showing that you signed off on Caleb's adoption while Eleanor was unconscious. How could that happen? Dr. Malvern sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said finally. There were complications during the delivery. Twin B, Caleb, was struggling to breathe, and he was taken to the neonatal unit. Eleanor was in critical condition. The hospital administration made a decision. What decision? Eleanor demanded, her voice shaking. To place Twin B for adoption, Dr. Malvern said. The hospital had a partnership with Ridgewood Family Services. They believed it was in the best interest of the child to find him a stable home immediately. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. Without my consent? Without even telling me he existed? Dr. Malvern looked away, shame flickering across his face. You were unconscious, and they insisted it was standard protocol in emergency situations. I was pressured to sign the paperwork. Sandra's voice was cold. Pressured? By who? Dr. Malvern hesitated. The hospital board. They wanted to expedite the process. They said it was for the best, given the circumstances. For the best? Eleanor's voice rose, her anger boiling over. You stole my son from me and gave him away without my knowledge. How is that for the best? I didn't agree with it, Dr. Malvern said quietly. But I was a doctor under their authority. I didn't have the power to overrule them. Eleanor stood, her hands trembling. You had the power to say no. You had the power to do the right thing. Sandra placed a calming hand on Eleanor's arm. We need more than an apology, she said, her tone firm. We need proof. Who on the hospital board made this decision? Dr. Malvern sighed again. I don't know who specifically made the call. But the CEO at the time was Richard Halstead. If anyone orchestrated this, it was him. Eleanor and Sandra exchanged a look of determination. Thank you, Sandra said curtly. We'll take it from here. As they left the cottage, Eleanor's emotions threatened to overwhelm her. I can't believe this happened, she said, tears streaming down her face. They took Caleb from me like he was nothing. Sandra squeezed her arm. We'll get justice, Eleanor. For both of them. They returned home that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. As they watched Alden and Caleb play together, their laughter filling the house, Eleanor felt a surge of resolve. She would fight for the truth, no matter what it took. This isn't over, she whispered to Sandra. Not by a long shot. Sandra nodded, her eyes filled with the same determination. We'll get to the bottom of it. Together. The next morning, Eleanor and Sandra sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, armed with the information Dr. Malvern had reluctantly provided. The name Richard Halstead, the former CEO of Ridgewood General Hospital, now loomed large in their investigation. They were determined to confront him and uncover the full truth about why Caleb had been separated from his brother. Eleanor's laptop sat open on the table as they searched for any current information about Halstead. It didn't take long to find him. He was now a private healthcare consultant, living in a sprawling estate just outside of Ridgewood. His public profile painted him as a successful and respected figure in the medical field, but to Eleanor and Sandra, he was the man who had orchestrated an unforgivable act. "We need to talk to him," Eleanor said firmly. "He was in charge. He knows what happened." Sandra nodded in agreement. "We'll go today. The sooner we get answers, the better." The drive to Halstead's estate was tense and quiet. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing with what she would say. Sandra sat beside her, scrolling through the notes they had compiled from the hospital records and their conversation with Dr. Malvern. When they arrived, the sight of the grand estate only fueled Eleanor's anger. The large, gated property exuded wealth and power, a stark contrast to the pain and loss that had defined the last decade for Eleanor and her family. She parked the car just outside the gate and pressed the intercom button. "Hello," came a crisp, authoritative voice. "This is Eleanor Porter and Sandra Delaney," Eleanor said, her voice steady but cold. "We need to speak with Richard Halstead. It's about Ridgewood General Hospital and a decision made 10 years ago." There was a long pause before the gate buzzed and slowly opened. They exchanged a glance before driving through, their determination outweighing any nerves. A butler greeted them at the front door and led them to a spacious office where Halstead sat behind a massive oak desk. He was an older man now, with silver hair and a sharp gaze that spoke of years spent in positions of authority. He gestured for them to sit, his expression neutral. "What can I do for you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already had an idea. Eleanor wasted no time. 10 years ago, I gave birth to twin boys at Ridgewood General. One of them, Caleb, was taken from me and placed for adoption without my knowledge or consent. You were the CEO at the time, and we believe you were involved in that decision." Halstead's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Do you have proof?" Sandra leaned forward, placing a copy of the hospital records on his desk. "This document shows that Caleb was sent to the neonatal unit and then adopted out under your administration. Dr. Malvern confirmed that the decision came from the hospital board, and from you." Halstead studied the document, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or recognition. "I remember the case," he said quietly. "There were complications during the delivery. The mother," he glanced at Eleanor, "was unconscious and in critical condition. The hospital had a partnership with Ridgewood Family Services, and we believed placing the child for adoption was the best option." "The best option for who?" Eleanor snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "Certainly not for me or my sons. You had no right to make that decision." Halstead sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're right. It wasn't my decision to make. But at the time, the board was focused on reducing liability and ensuring the child's welfare. It was a mistake, and I regret that it happened under my watch." Sandra's voice was cold. "A mistake? That's all you have to say? Your mistake tore a family apart for 10 years. Halstead's composure wavered, and he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her resolve unshaken. "I want an apology, for me, for Alden, and for Caleb. And I want you to ensure this never happens to another family. No more partnerships with adoption agencies that prioritize speed over ethics. No more decisions made without a mother's consent." Halstead nodded slowly. "You have my word. I'll issue a formal apology, and I'll work to change the policies that allowed this to happen." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained strong. "It's too late to undo what's been done, but it's not too late to do the right thing." As they left the estate, Eleanor and Sandra felt a sense of closure begin to form. They had confronted the man responsible for the injustice, and though it wouldn't erase the pain of the past, it was a step toward healing. When they returned home, Alden and Caleb ran to greet them, their identical faces lighting up with joy. Eleanor knelt down, pulling both boys into a tight hug. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice filled with conviction. "We're together now, and that's what matters." Sandra stood nearby, her own heart swelling with gratitude as she watched the boys laugh and play. The journey had been long and painful, but they had uncovered the truth. And now, they could finally begin to move forward as a family. The months following their meeting with Richard Halstead brought a mixture of healing and new beginnings for Eleanor, Sandra, Alden, and Caleb. Though the scars of the past remained, the truth had given them a sense of closure and the opportunity to rebuild their lives as a united family. Both women had vowed to ensure their sons never felt the pain of separation again. Eleanor and Sandra arranged a schedule that allowed the twins to spend equal time in both households. The boys adjusted to their new routine quickly, moving seamlessly between their homes with an ease that only deepened their already unbreakable bond. Weekdays were spent attending school and extracurricular activities together, while weekends often turned into adventures, hiking trips, movie nights, and hours of play in the backyard. One Saturday afternoon, the families gathered at Eleanor's house for a barbecue, celebrating the boys' 11th birthday. The backyard was alive with laughter and conversation as friends and family came together to honor the twins. Balloons in shades of green and blue, the boys' favorite colors, floated above the picnic tables, and a large cake sat waiting on the patio. Alden and Caleb were inseparable as always, running between the guests and occasionally stopping to marvel at the fact that this was their first birthday together. "I can't believe I used to celebrate without you," Caleb said, nudging Alden as they sat on the grass. "It feels like we've always been together." "Me too," Alden replied with a grin. "It's like we're finally where we're supposed to be." Eleanor watched them from the patio, her heart swelling with gratitude. Sandra stood beside her, holding a glass of lemonade. "They're happy," Sandra said softly. "That's all that matters." Eleanor nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "For so long, I felt like something was missing, even though I couldn't explain it. Now I know it was Caleb. He was always meant to be here." When it was time to cut the cake, everyone gathered around the boys, who beamed as they blew out the candles together. The moment felt surreal to Eleanor, a culmination of all the pain, hope, and love that had defined their journey. After the party, as the last of the guests trickled out, Eleanor and Sandra sat on the patio, watching Alden and Caleb chase fireflies in the fading light. The boys' laughter filled the air, their joy uncontainable. "We've come so far," Eleanor said, her voice filled with emotion. "There were times I didn't think I'd ever find peace with what happened." "But you did," Sandra replied. "We both did. And now we have this, a family." Eleanor smiled. "They're lucky to have you. Caleb is so loved, and now we all get to share that." Sandra placed a hand on Eleanor's arm. "You're an amazing mom, Eleanor. Alden and Caleb are both so lucky to have you." As the evening turned to night, Eleanor called the boys inside. They protested, insisting they needed just a few more minutes to catch the biggest firefly ever. Laughing, Eleanor relented, watching them dart across the lawn together. She marveled at their connection, a bond that no amount of time or distance could break. Later, as the boys settled into bed, Eleanor sat between them, a book in her lap. It had become their nightly tradition, reading together before they drifted off to sleep. Caleb and Alden rested on either side of her, their eyes heavy but content. "Mom," Alden said, his voice drowsy. "Yes, sweetheart," Eleanor replied, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'm glad Caleb's here now. It feels right." Eleanor's heart swelled, and she placed a kiss on his forehead. "Me too, Alden. Me too." Caleb chimed in, his voice muffled by his pillow. It's like we're finally whole. Eleanor smiled, her eyes misting. That's because we are, my loves. We're a family now, and nothing will ever change that. As the boys drifted off to sleep, their identical faces relaxed in peaceful slumber, Eleanor stayed by their side, watching over them. The journey had been long and painful, but the bond they shared was worth every moment. Together, they had faced the truth, overcome the past, and built a future filled with love and unity. As she turned off the light and quietly left the room, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. Her sons were together, their laughter and love filling the home in a way she had never imagined possible. And for the first time in over a decade, she allowed herself to believe in the power of new beginnings.